Suspend your disbelief, your rational, analytic mind, just for a minute, just for the length of this podcast. What if all I am about to tell you is the truth? What if the information you will be provided is from a divine source? Just for this time, I am your Axis Mundi. Consider this podcast your channel, your second opinion. When I do a reading, something larger than myself is working through me. So ask what you wish. This is your channel, your doorway to the divine.
Hi, and welcome to John's Tarot. I hope you're all having a really good week out there. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I thought today I would talk about something that's been on my mind a little bit. I try to come up with thoughtful topics that are relevant.
Oh, far out, man.
But what's been on my mind lately is the idea of transitions. Transitions in life, where we go from one part of life into another part of life. I call these transitions thresholds. Thresholds rarely looks like opportunity when you're standing in it. It usually looks like crisis, humiliation, loss, or uncertainty. Only later do we recognize that it was a doorway. Thresholds are moments in life when life forces transformation, and we either step forward or we remain stuck where we are. Life will place thresholds in front of all of us. The question is not whether they appear, but whether we have the courage to step through them. Thresholds are moments in life when something shifts inside us. Moments when the life we have been living can no longer continue the way it was. Psychologists sometimes call these turning points. Spiritual traditions call them awakenings. I think of them as thresholds. A threshold is a doorway between one life and another. Most of the time we don't recognize these moments while we are standing in them. They often look like crisis, failure, or unbearable pressure. But when we look back later, we realize something important happened in that moment. We crossed a doorway, and life was never quite the same again. A threshold is the moment where an existing structure in our lives stops working. It might be a behavior, a belief, a relationship, a career path, or a way we understand ourselves. For a long time, we managed to maintain that structure, even if it isn't healthy or sustainable. Humans are very good at maintaining patterns, even when they're painful. Eventually, something happens that exposes the truth. The pattern cannot continue. That realization creates tension. We suddenly see two worlds at once. On one side is the familiar life we already know. On the other side is something unknown that requires change. The threshold is the narrow space between those two realities. Standing at a threshold often feels uncomfortable or frightening because the old life is falling apart, but the new life is not fully formed yet. It is a period of uncertainty. Many people describe common sensations when they are at one of these moments. There is often a strong sense of pressure, as if circumstances are closing in. Avoidance stops working. The strategies that once allowed us to cope begin to fail. A decision becomes unavoidable. Another feature of thresholds is they rarely appear as obvious opportunities. More often they appear as crises or disruptions. Examples are addiction, reaching a breaking point, illness, financial collapse, a relationship ending, or a moment when we suddenly see ourselves clearly for the first time. In mythology and psychology, thresholds are the beginning of transformation. Joseph Campbell described them as the moment when the hero crosses from the ordinary world into the unknown. Carl Jung described similar moments as encounters with the unconscious, where a person begins the process of individuation. But thresholds are not only grand mythological events, they occur in everyday human life. A decision to get sober, choosing to return to school, accepting the death of a loved one, facing illness honestly. These moments mark the boundary between the two phases of life. What makes the threshold powerful is that standing still is no longer possible. Once we see the truth of the situation, we must choose. We can step forward into change, or we can try to retreat into the old patterns. The difficulty is that stepping forward requires courage. It often requires humility, acceptance of reality, and the willingness to move into uncertainty. Yet when people look back at their lives years later, many of the most important developments began at these uncomfortable moments. The threshold was the place where transformation began. This is why the concept matters. Thresholds reveal that difficult moments are sometimes the very events that allow life to reorganize itself into something new. Sometimes the role of a human being is simply to hold the door open for someone else while they gather the courage to step through. At this point, I'm going to provide a couple of examples of threshold events in my life. This first one I call dying on the beach. And I've talked about this kind of thing before. I'm coming up on 37 years of sobriety. So 36 years ago, I was hopelessly addicted. I always say I was a tongue-chewing, babbling, dumpster-diving, idiot alcoholic. Meth-using idiot alcoholic. And I could feel that my life can't go on this way much longer. People around me were dying. One died from a brain aneurysm. The other one died from an automobile accident. Some of them were going to prison. And I realized, I wasn't that lucky to begin with. And my number was coming up. So there was going to have to be some change, some major change in my life. And it wasn't that easy for me just to come to that conclusion, that decision. I really had to weigh it out and struggle with it. What happened was I made the decision to move into sobriety. I had no idea what sobriety was. I thought it was just stopping bad habits, but it involved more than that. And when I got into a 12-step program and I started to understand more deeply what was going to be entailed in this process, I described that as, well, my sobriety date is June 6, 1989. And that just so happens, June 6th, to be D-Day. And my life was very much like that. That was D-Day for me, my day on the beach. And I was either going to die on the beach or I was going to stand up and move forward. But I couldn't remain on the beach any longer. And my decision was that no matter what, I was going to go ahead and move forward with my life because I knew exactly what laid behind me. And I didn't want any more of that. So whatever laid in front of me had to be better than what was behind me. So I decided that at that point, that was a threshold, that I was going to move forward into a new life, no matter what it brought. And actually, 37 years later, it was the best decision I made in my life. But it was a turning point. I can remember making that decision. Another experience had to do with this one I call synchronicity about school. So I was about a year sober. And a year sober, and I'm doing okay, except I'm not making any money. I was behind rent. I was behind on rent on my little studio apartment. It seemed like everybody around me in the program was doing well, Oh, I've been made vice president of the company. They've given me a company car, and I'm dating a supermodel. And things were not that good for me. I was working minimum wage jobs. I couldn't seem to get ahead. And I was behind financially, and I was just really frustrated with the process. Well, early one morning, I woke up, and I was a Buddhist at that time, and I had a Gohonzon, and that was my higher power. And I did my prayer to the Gohonzon was that I remember, when am I going to get mine? Well, I went off to work. I was working at a paint store doing labor work. I'd always been doing labor work my whole life. And I'm totally frustrated. Started that way in the morning. And I had a little Pinto car. And I decided to go somewhere for lunch, leave the paint store and go to lunch. Well, the car had expired tags. I got pulled over by the police. the police found that I had old warrants. I'm already about a year sober, 13 months sober, like that. And then they had to take me into jail. So they take me into jail. I'm obviously going to lose my job. They impound my car. When I finally see the judge, he looks at my past record. And my past record wasn't that bad. I was kind of a ne'er-do-well, undesirable element of society with a history of petty theft and goofy stuff like that. Anyway, so and I had disregarded a court appearance on one of my problems, and the judge looked at it and he said, "I'm giving you 30 days." Okay, I didn't argue about it. I didn't try to defend myself. Actually, I looked at it like, well, I've done a lot of bad things in my life, and it's time to make some amends. So they gave me 30 days. I went to a local farm, and I did some work for 3 weeks. At about 3 weeks, they let me out, for good behavior. And it was kind of interesting what happened. What happened was that a guy I knew in the program, he says, "John," he goes, I'm leaving the area for a year. I have to go and do some work out of state. If you stay at my house and paint the inside," he said, "you could stay there free for a year." My landlady, who I owed back rent to, says, "John, I got some units. If you just paint the units, I will call it even." Okay, so I painted the units. That old job that I had lost sent me my back pay, and it was just enough money to get my car out of impound and pay for current registration. And all that happened at one time. And I thought about it a little bit. I said, well, this might be a good opportunity for me to go back to school. I don't have a big overhead to worry about. Why don't I go back to school? And I went back to school, local community college, and I got a certificate in drug and alcohol studies and an Associate of Arts degree. After I got that education part done, I started working in mental health. I worked at a local psychiatric hospital for about 7 years, and I started out there as a mental health worker, and then I moved to, unit secretary, and I also did groups, and I did counseling and things like that. But it was as I look back at that period of time, that was a threshold event. As bad as it seemed, I'm having to go to jail, I'm losing my job, I've never had to return back to actual physical manual labor in terms of means of employment. I was working in semi-professional positions, unit secretary, mental health worker, and now nurse. I moved forward, but that was a pivotal point, a threshold moment. I said that prayer, and the universe responded. Now, at the time, it doesn't seem that way, that this was going to be the answer to my prayers. Be careful what you ask for. But it was a pivotal threshold event for me. So now I am able to, many years later, now I'm a nurse, I'm working on the ICU, and this whole thing of threshold events has really just kind of been within the last year for me, where I'm identifying clearly what's going on. But I have been responding to threshold events in people's lives on the ICU I've been on ICU for like 25 years now. And let me give you some examples of how I respond to threshold events. I had a young man, well, he wasn't that young, he was in his 40s. He was overdosed on, I forget what he overdosed on, I think fentanyl and alcohol, and he was kind of messed up. And he was surrounded by sober people. He had a sponsor. He had a 12-step sponsor. He had a family who was very concerned about him, and those types of things. So he had positive influences in his life, but he just wasn't staying sober. So often what I do on ICU, especially when I get people who are, end up intubated and everything from the overdose, once we got him extubated, I went in there to talk to him, and I think his family was in there at that time, and I give him little newcomer chips. I get them off of Amazon. I buy a bunch of them, and all the alcoholics, I give them a little AA newcomer chip, and I give them a little 5-cent talk. And I gave this guy the little talk, and it usually has something about, I really wish you would join us. I go to meetings. This is the place I go to meetings. Why don't you come and join us? It doesn't have to be this way. And I'll get you a cup of coffee. We'd really like to see you join us. And I leave them with the coin. I leave them with the token. That's called a threshold object. I understand that now. That is what a threshold object. Where at just one moment in time, they're offered a choice. It doesn't have to be that way. You have an opportunity to make a choice. The choice is up to you. It's your choice. And then I leave the room. When I walk back by, I see the family all begging him, oh, whatever his name was, oh, Bobby, please, you got to try to convince him to make a positive choice. I see that's going on. But I have done my part. I've offered him a choice, and I choose not to re-enter the system. I've given him the object. I've given him the choice. Now it's up to him. And I've done that many times. The final one I want to talk about is a threshold that I've dealt with just recently, where I have a patient he's like 92, and the family, and he's intubated, and he's got multi-system organ failure, and his chances of recovery are poor to none due to his condition. And the family doesn't want to let go. They don't want to let go, and they don't want to do. They don't want to do what's being suggested by the physicians, which is either, your choices are going to either be get trach and peg and continue on in a nursing home, or it's going to be end of life comfort care. So these are the choices that's being offered to the family, and they don't want to make a choice. I don't, that's how that is. Well, I kind of got acquainted with the family. I had the room next to them for a day. They saw me, and I didn't interact with them. It wasn't my patient. They just saw me. I went in the room once or twice to turn pumps on and off or something like that, or to turn alarms on and off. And I reassure them everything's going to be all right. Well, the next day I end up with this family as I'm assigned to this patient load. All right. And I talk to the daughter, and the daughter's like, what's going on? What's happening here? And I sit them down. I show them chest x-rays. I show them doctor's reports. I show them doctor's notes. I show them labs. And then they start asking me questions. Well, what is he suffering? And I have to answer, I don't think he's physically suffering based on what I'm seeing on the vital signs, but what's going on with him psychologically, I cannot tell. I would imagine having that tube in him for a long time is not a comfortable position for him to be in. And I just tell him the truth. And they start asking me questions about comfort care and ask me questions like that. And that's okay. Now, that's one of those situations where, again, I'm standing at the doorway. And it's up to them where they want to walk through. They come up to me and they ask me questions about the doorway, what's on the other side of the doorway. And it's the same type of thing I did with when I give away threshold objects. I am standing at the doorway. I'm the guardian of the door. And I give them the object. In this case, though, they're asking me questions about what is the right thing to do. And I told the family, though, especially the daughter, I told her that there are no right or wrong decisions in this situation. You're being offered two choices, like comfort care or trach and peg. There's no right or wrong. I'm supportive of you, whichever you choose, but it is going to be up to you to make the decision. And they finally made their decision, and it was okay. I'm not going to discuss what their decision was, but it was their decision, and I helped that family step through the threshold in order to make their decision. Now, generally, I want to tell you, when you have to make these types of decisions in life, that what's most important is that you can live with your decision. It doesn't matter what anybody thinks, just that you can live with your decision. And I think this family made the right decision for that situation. Although I did not encourage it, I just held the doorway open. So those are a couple of examples of threshold events and how I see threshold events in my daily work life. So let's move over to do the tarot. I have each week, I give you a free tarot spread so you could take a look at these. So let's take a look at this week's tarot spread. Well, I hope you enjoyed my little story about thresholds and some of my experience in identifying thresholds and helping people across. I really don't help them across. I just identify the threshold. And like I said, hold the door open. And it's up to them. It's up to each individual, given their circumstances, what they choose to do. But this is the part of the program where I do a little tarot reading. I give you tarot spread, a free tarot spread. That's one good thing about listening to John's Tarot. You get something free every week. So this week I'm going to talk about how to identify. I'm going to give you a spread that has to do with threshold events. My ability to read tarot is a gift, an expression of divine love, and I'm here to share it with you in that same spirit. And I usually give you a free spread, and this week, card 1 on the free spread is going to be the threshold. What situation or life change is bringing you to the edge of transformation? Card 2 will be what must be left behind, the habit, identity, or belief that cannot cross the threshold. Card 3, the guardian at the gate, the fear, challenge, or resistance that must be faced. Card 4, the inner resource, the strength, wisdom, or experience that can help you cross. And card 5, the emerging self, the new orientation or identity that begins to form after crossing. So I can only do these about myself or about another person and at a specific moment in time. So let's say, describe my threshold event at the time when I was going to be dying on the beach. So at that period, 37 years ago, 36, 37 years ago, when I was going to be dying on the beach, I was at a threshold. Please provide me with a reading regarding that particular time and event. All right, let me cut the cards. Okay, my first card is the King of Swords. Second card is the Death card. And I'll go back and read these. I'll throw some runes on it. The third card is the Ten of Pentacles. Fourth card is the High Priestess. How very appropriate is that one? And then the final card, is the Sun. I'm always amazed when the cards come out and they provide me an answer, and it seems like a random pull, but there's something more going on with tarot. It's not just random. I also throw some runes on these as I read it. So for the King of Swords, at the threshold, what situation or life change has brought me to the edge of transformation when I was dying on the beach? And the rune is Iwaz. It looks like the letter M. The King of Swords and Iwaz. So I was seeing the truth. The King of Swords is a sword of truth. It was cutting through illusion. And that was the threshold I was at. I was seeing the truth. If I didn't change my ways, I was going to join my friends in the morgue. And I just wasn't ready to do that. And then the rune Iwaz has to do with a dignified way to cross. It has to do with a horse, a noble beast, a noble way to make that change. So what changed in our life situation was bringing me to the edge of transformation. I was seeing the truth, and I was being offered a noble way, in order to make that change. The second card, what must be left behind? The habit, identity, or belief that cannot cross the threshold. That's the Death card. And the rune is radio. So the threshold, that was life or death. That was a life or death threshold. And I had to make a life change. And usually a Death card doesn't mean death. It usually means death of an old way of being, death of an old pattern, death of an old habit. In this case, it could mean all those things. It was a life or death decision. And that was a situation or life change that was bringing me to the edge of transformation. Was I ready to die? And was I willing to give up my identity, my way of being, my family patterns, all these deeply ingrained things? And the rune radio that has to do with, the right way has to do with taking a journey, a wagon. And in that case, it was definitely a right decision, radio, and it was definitely has to do with death of the old self and making that journey, and that journey being the right decision. And for the 10 of Pentacles, the rune is Dagaz. It looks like an X with a line on each side of it. So the guardian at the gate, the fear, challenge, or resistance that I had to face at that time. That has to do, you see an older man, white hair, and he has a family that he's trying to help and support, and he is a possessor of great wisdom and great wealth, and that was the guardian at the gate, the fear or challenge or resistance. So there was people I was involved with that were much wiser in regards to this situation. And was I going to accept their help and guidance in crossing that barrier? And these guys, this was early sobriety for me. This question happened in like the early sobriety, in the early month or two, where I'm making that decision. And there was definitely people much wiser than me in regards to the problem I was dealing with. And was I going to accept their decision? And the rune Dagaz has to do with breakthrough. I made the decision, and my decision was that no matter what, this is what I was going to do. That I had already been to the edge of the abyss, with my toes hanging over the cliff, and I knew what was on the other side of that abyss, and I chose to take a different path, and that was the breakthrough. So, card 4, the inner resource, the strength, wisdom, or experience that can help you cross. And I have the High Priestess, and the rune is Berkana. It looks like the letter B. The inner resource. You see the High Priestess there. On each side of her, she has these two towers, Boaz and Jachin, and it also has to do with from the Kabbalah, mercy and the tough lessons and mercy. I'll put it that way. I can't remember the exact term for it. And I stood at the gate. And the High Priestess stands at the gate, and she only lets people cross who are willing to make the sacrifice and who are willing to have learned their lesson and are willing to move forward. And she stands at the gate at the Temple of Solomon, Joaz, and I think that's Bakin anyway. And I was willing to did I have the inner resource, the strength, the wisdom, or experience that could help you cross? So I had all the bad experiences that I needed, and I was willing to make the crossing. And the rune is Berkana, and that has to do with family support from the universe. It also has to do with constraint, considered the use of, it has to do with flowing into a new form. And I was willing to flow into a new form. And what's that, 28? And I was ready to flow into the new form, no matter what. I didn't have anything to lose. I'm trying to do editing here while I'm doing the podcast. And the final rune is the sun, and that has to do with the emerging self, the new orientation or identity that begins to form after the crossing. Oh, how very appropriate. And the rune is called Wunjo, and it looks like the letter P, and it really has to do with ripening of fruit, completion, reward for work hard done. And then the emerging self, the sun, has to do with a job well done, finishing an assignment, overcoming obstacles. And that's what I did with getting sober in regards to that moment in time. And then the rune Wunjo is I'm enjoying the fruits of a sober life at this point. I'm looking at retirement. I got money in the bank. My little condo's paid off. I got some health things going on, but on the outside and on the inside too, I am a much better person on the inside. I am relatively happy every day of my life, and I still feel like the fruits of a sober life is to have that whole life, is to have some failures and successes, and to learn from my failures and to move on, and really, have a family and a home and a career, and those are the fruits of a sober life. Well, for today, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast.
Goodbye, Professor Marvel, and thanks a lot.
It was my pleasure. And I hope you tune in next week. Tune in. That's old school. We don't tune in anymore. We're on the internet. But I hope you join me next week. And I'll think of a good topic for next week. Hey, if you are interested in me doing a weekend retreat for somebody, for a group, I'd be happy to do that. The basis of the truth retreat would be 12 steps, or how to use the tarot in the 12 steps, or the Soul Awakening series, or something like that. Send me an email and let me know if that is something you're interested in. So until next week, be careful, be cool, be kind, and remember, find strength, have faith, and I'll see you all next week. All right, bye-bye.